Hello, 6:30, June 30th, disinformation, dis&datInformation. Today we're going to do David Ricardo and classical political economy. I'm going to read from the notes of Ed George and from on David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, Chapter 2 on rent. And because that's kind of the thing I'm working on right now. And I've included 3 videos from Anwar Sheikh's introduction to classical political economy, that is Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And I hope that will be useful, assuming that I can get all these things happening.
Welcome to this class, which is Historical Foundations 1. We will be covering Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And though this is a course on the history of economic thought, I want you to approach it also as a course on alternate foundations in economics. Because I'm going to try to make the argument as I proceed that Smith, Ricardo, and Marx had a superior understanding of how the system worked, and I'm going to try to show you that not only analytically in reference to their work, but in the reference to modern developments along these lines, and also empirical evidence. That a course on the Welcome to this class, which is Historical Foundations 1. We will be covering Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And though this is a course on the history of economic thought, I want you to approach it also as a course on alternate foundations in economics. Because I'm going to try to make the argument as I proceed that Smith, Ricardo, and Marx had a superior understanding of how the system worked, and I'm going to try to show you that not only analytically in reference to their work, but in the reference to modern developments along these lines, and also empirical evidence. That a course on the history of economic thought would begin by talking about the state of the world today. But if you keep in mind what I said at the beginning, that this course should be also viewed as an alternate foundation for the world as we find it and as it's developed over time, then perhaps it's not so odd. We know, for instance, that in recent times there's been a huge upsurge in globalization. Globalization meaning the movement of businesses from one country to another, the movement of financial capital from one country to another, and to a lesser extent, the movement of direct investment, and even to a lesser extent, the movement of people. But there are these movements churning across the globe, and they're having a profound impact on how the system operates. It's important to keep in mind that from the beginning, capitalism was always a very global system. But the boundaries of this global nature were smaller. Of course, the countries in the times of Smith and Ricardo were also imperial powers, so they had global reach. Capitalism coming out of England reached across Europe, which is its globalization in that time. Financial capital, direct investment, and even mobility of labor. So it has always been a system whose boundaries are fluid and developing over time. And there may be bursts where it's more extensive or where the capture, so to speak, within the system is greater, but it has always been on the move. At the present time, this globalization goes hand in hand with an extraordinary unevenness and unevenness in the world. There are over 1 billion people who live on less than $1 a day, which is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. There are 40 or more million people who are undernourished, who simply don't get enough food in a time when we have the ability to produce enough food for the whole world many times over. There is widespread female unemployment. There's illiteracy. There's poverty on a very great scale. Inequality is very great, also in another sense that within every country inequality has been rising for decades. And over time, over the last 2 centuries, there has been a tremendous change in inequality. That is to say, the poorest countries have often moved very slowly, and the richer countries move relatively fast, and the gap between them has gone up tremendously. The work of Angus Madison, for instance, is a good statement of these long-term trends. From his work, we can see, for instance, that in 1820, the richest countries of the world were only 3 times as rich as the poorest countries. Think of that, 3 to 1. By 1913, the ratio of rich to poor countries was 11 to 1, rich to the poorest, 35 to 1 in 1950, 44 to 1 in 1973, 72 to 1 in 1992, and it's still higher now. These things are easily discovered. You can go to the UN reports or World Bank reports. They're done all the time about globalization and world inequality. Within the countries, within all capitalist countries, with very few exceptions, there has been a rise of inequality among the bottom and the top. The Occupy movement, which was so important in New York, in the US, and also similar movements in Europe, talk about the 99% of the 1%. But if we look over time, we can see these rising over time, that this is something that didn't just happen. It goes in waves. The distances widen, then perhaps they narrow through social efforts, and then they widen again as they have been recently. Unemployment on a world scale is massive. I make this point every year, but it's important for people to understand that when we talk about unemployment figures, the official measure of unemployment is anyone who's had any work in the last week or last month. That means even 2 hours work counts as being employed. And when you talk about official measures of unemployment on a world scale, you have to understand that these measures are not adequate as they are presented, but they're presented because they're not adequate, because they are convenient. Proper measures would take into account people who have part-time work and count them differently than people who have full-time work for obvious reasons. Would take into account people who are out of work and looking for work but have given up. They're not counted as unemployed under the current orthodox statistics. And people who are, for various reasons, taken away from the workforce, including people in institutions who are, technically speaking, without jobs, but are not counted as employed or unemployed. And there is a relation between unemployment and imprisonment. So it's not just an abstract issue. Unemployment rates are very high now across many countries because of the global crisis, and we will come back at the end of the course to talk about the causes and operations of the global crisis, the consequences of global crisis. Most importantly, what is striking about the modern world is the discrepancy between what's possible and what exists. And that discrepancy puts a tremendous pressure politically and socially in every country now. We know we can do many things that we can't do for political reasons, social reasons. If you look at it from this point of view, it is quite striking that there are really two different, and I'm going to argue for a third, vision of how the system functions. Base visions, visions that you begin from. And so the first point is that economics is a profession riven by disagreement about how capitalism functions. Everybody here, I think, has had some exposure to neoclassical economics, right? Who has not taken a course in micro, let's say? Well, let me put it differently. How many people have taken a course in micro? Good. And macro also? Okay, so you have an idea that the standard tradition in economics is of neoclassical economics. Now, neoclassical economics is a tradition that arose after the classical tradition, which we'll be talking about in the course. And in fact, it arose as a kind of effort to distance itself from the implications of the classical system. And I will come to that as we proceed. But let me begin by saying what are the characteristic features of neoclassical economics. And these are features describing the system in terms of optimality and in terms of perfections. Perfections of the market, perfections of firms, perfections of consumers, rationality, meaning some kind of what I call hyper-rationality, choice rules. And in this framework, in this vision of capitalism, there are certain key features which are characteristic of neoclassical economics. One is the idea that self-interest is a dominant human motive. Not that it is a motive, but that it is the dominant human motive. And one can challenge that, but the point is that this is part of the structure of that theory. The second is that the behavior of agents, so-called consumers, households, firms, can be characterized by maximizing behavior, maximizing of some objective function, some property. For instance, what is it that consumers in neoclassical theory are supposed to be maximizing? Pardon? Consumers. Utility, right? Now, utility is a very mysterious substance. It is more mysterious than ether in the old pre-Newtonian days or post-Newtonian days. It is a very mysterious property, and it's a property that's quite distinctly associated with neoclassical economics. I won't have time here, but we'll come back to that issue when we talk about Ricardo and the term utility as it was developed in the classical tradition. What's a maximizing principle, what's a maximizing object for firms in neoclassical theory? Profit, okay. So that is somewhat easier because that's an objective function, right? Utility is subjective, but profit is comparable and objective. And the idea is that you can tell the same story for firms and for consumers, which is that they are both rational entities that seek to get the most of this thing that they want, whether it's utility or profit, subject to the constraints that they are given. In this vision of sort of passive agents, you're not allowed, for instance, to go and take anything from your neighbor. That's not part of utility maximizing, though it would certainly improve your initial endowment if you did it. And firms are not allowed to go in and burn down each other's warehouses, though it would be known historically to do that. It's not, as they say, in the model. What is in the model is a notion of competition. Competition is a very driving element of the model because it leads to a series of outcomes, and these outcomes are perfect outcomes in an important way. In the commodity markets, different sellers of the same product are assumed to be competing for customers, and they do that by selling ultimately at the same price. So they have a common price. That's why firms are assumed to face a common price, because underneath that story is this idea that competition forces them to take a common price. You have labor markets in which workers are assumed to be trying to get jobs at a common wage. And you have, of course, financial markets and capital markets in which different agents there are making choices at a common profit rate. Now, that idea of the common price, common wage, common profit rate can be traced back to the classical tradition. But I will try and show you that it appears there in a very different manner. For now, we take it as a feature of the orthodoxy that this is an aspect of the model, an aspect of the vision of this commonality, but perfect equality. Commonality not just as a tendency, but as something which is achieved in practice as an equality. Fourth, a characteristic feature of this model is that full employment is the automatic outcome of market processes. If competition operates in its proper way, then everyone who wants a job will get a job. And that's a base property, very fundamental property of the system. What is interesting about this vision is that individual agents are very limited in their power. They're essentially agents that react to the situation that they're given, but they do not act in any way to change that situation, to modify, to take from others, to have any kind of aggressive or antagonistic behavior. Antagonisms are eliminated by assumption. Again, this is an important point because in the classical tradition, antagonisms are inherent in competition, and I'm going to come back to that. The fundamental feature of neoclassical economics is its idealization of capitalism, the presentation of the system with reference to some ideal framework. That ideal framework, we know, involves perfect competition, which you should have experienced when you do micro and macro. The idea that firms are small, that they believe they have no effect on the price, so therefore all they do is to seek to get the maximum profit they can from the conditions that they have at the moment, their cost curves and price offered to them by the market. Consumers are assumed to be similarly passive. They take the prices given and they seek to get the maximum utility by mixing the mixture by changing the mixture of the products that they choose to consume. Workers are similarly impotent. They take a wage as given and they seek the employment that they can get that wage. So this idea of impotent individuals, or at least very passive individual agents, is fundamental to the consequences of the model, which is that the optimal results are achieved by adding on another set of assumptions, which is, of course, the idea that every agent has perfect or close to perfect knowledge of the possibilities inherent in their choice set. So firms know about the things they need to know about, consumers the same way, workers the same way. And then if you put this whole set of assumptions together, you get a set of conclusions. And the conclusions are that this system produces the best of all possible outcomes from any given set of initial conditions, which we call in economics initial endowments. Now, of course, you could ask, well, why do we have those initial endowments? But I think that's a secondary question to whether or not this construction represents accurately the processes of the actual system. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. If you approach the system from this idealized framework, that the system produces the best of all possible outcomes, that it produces full employment, producers are matched in some optimal manner, this idealization then leads to a natural conclusion, which is that there is no role or a very limited role for the state. Because the system effectively does all the things that are necessary. The state is there, yes, it's behind the scenes, it's there to maintain the order, it's to enforce the rules, so that if you decide you don't want to be a perfect competitor and would rather steal from your neighbor, then the state has to be brought into the story. But that's really sotto voce. It comes off stage. It's not a central player because it's only needed to maintain the structure, but doesn't have any active role within this idealized framework. Now, of course, it's as you study a textbook in, say, micro, you get at some point, if you make it that far, you get to talk about things like externalities and imperfections. And so brought into the story at the end, once you have developed this as your starting point, is the idea that, well, perhaps not everything works that way, that well. You may have situations in which one person's actions may influence another. What's an externality? In a micro textbook, what is a classic example of an externality?
Smoking neighbor.
Pardon?
Smoking neighbor.
Yes, exactly. Which, by the way, is now like a dinosaur. They don't exist anymore, but
Europe.
yes, Europe, that's true. It's true, Europe. Or if you come from Turkey or something, yes. A smoking neighbor. Why? Because in the model, all your actions have an effect on the market in a negligible way, and they don't affect directly any of your other consumers. But a smoking neighbor, we now recognize, could have the consequences of having a medical effect on your neighbors. So if you smoke, it can affect them, and vice versa. So that is brought up as an externality. Now think about how interesting this is. An externality is something in which your behavior has an effect on others, which says that you have a model in which your interaction with others, direct interaction, is already excluded from the start. What a strange vision of human behavior and human society and human existence that is, to begin from a framework in which there is no direct interaction among individuals, except through the things that you buy. This notion that you only interact through the commodities that you own comes up in the classical tradition. Very importantly, in Marx, it comes up in his theory of commodity fetishism. The idea that you interact through the things that you purchase, through commodities, and not directly. But what is more striking and more interesting is that we begin from a framework in which human interactions are excluded, and then we're forced to bring in human interactions as an imperfection in the framework. I'm sorry, as an imperfection in the real world, rather than saying that this starting point is imperfect, in fact, fundamentally improper in the first place. Anthropologists typically are astounded at such a beginning because, of course, their focus is exactly on human interactions. And the idea that you begin from a notion of society in which humans don't interact directly except through things is quite striking. Nonetheless, this is the dominant tradition in economics to this day and has been for a very long time. Was the tradition that Keynes was struggling to break free from in the 1940s and 30s, actually, when he was writing the general theory. And this framework has continued, came back in fashion in the 60s and 70s, and dominates economic textbooks and economic discourse, and more importantly, economic policy today. So it is not just a framework that is a kind of interesting aside. It is the framework in economics. And in fact, most popular discussions of economics and talk about economics as it is only this. But it isn't only that. There is, has always been, an alternate set, alternate approach to economics. And the dominant one on the alternate side, on what is called heterodox economics, is that derived from Keynes and post-Keynesian economics. Many of you will experience that here in this place. You won't experience it in most other graduate schools in any degree, but we do a lot of post-Keynesian economics here. And in this, the emphasis is the opposite of the emphasis in neoclassical economics, where neoclassical economics focuses on perfections. Post-Keynesian economics typically focuses on imperfections. Imperfections in competition, imperfections in knowledge, imperfections in expectations, imperfections in institutions, in markets in general, in international trade. All of this is typically how heterodox economics has constructed its counter-argument to orthodox economics. So it is emphasized that history, culture, and institutions are the primary shaping forces in human motivation, not self-interest only, and not even self-interest as dominant. It is emphasized that stable economic patterns can emerge from a multiplicity of motivations. Neoclassical economics typically, you begin from a model in which all firms are exactly alike. Typically, post-Keynesian economists emphasize the multiplicity of firms, their differences in their cost conditions, their differences in their behavior patterns, so they emphasize the heterogeneity of firms, which appears, from the point of view of orthodox economics, as a set of imperfections. So they tend to emphasize that the market is in real life imperfect relative to this ideal model. They emphasize, therefore, oligopoly, monopoly, various forms of imperfections in knowledge, as I said before, in competition and in markets. Another very crucial feature of the heterodox tradition is the rejection of the claim that full employment is automatic, the neoclassical claim. Heterodox economists typically emphasize that unemployment is not only possible, but tends to be a persistent outcome. That's coming from Keynes, but also from Kaletsky. Heterodox economics emphasizes a self-enforcing influence of inequality of power, of wealth, and it typically puts weight on the state as a necessary counterforce to this imperfect set of institutions and markets. So the state, instead of appearing as something which is only in the off stage, so to speak, in neoclassical economics, becomes a central player. It becomes a potential counterforce and shaping force for the market and for institutions. And so the state becomes vested, so to speak, with the hopes for the improvement of capitalism. In fact, Keynes approaches capitalism precisely this way. Talks about the fact that the market produces outcomes which may be socially not desirable, and that you need the interaction of the state to produce more desirable social outcomes. Now, of course, he's talking in the time between wars, between World War I and the Great Depression, and already there's devastation in Europe, and he's arguing very much against the orthodox idea, which is to let the market take care of it. And he's saying, no, we need to intervene because the market doesn't take care of these things adequately. So there we have the two opposing traditions, the perfectionist tradition and the imperfectionist tradition. And if those traditions were adequate, then this course would only be a history of thought course, because it would be a kind of course of the roots of the two traditions. But I'm going to argue in this course that there's a third possibility, which is that there is a different vision of capitalism, which is rooted in the classical tradition, and that vision is not bound in the space between perfection and imperfection. On the contrary, the very idea of imperfection refers to perfection. I can't define an imperfection unless I tell me what the perfection is. And that means that when you speak in this vernacular, so to speak, of imperfectionism, you are already adopting as a point of departure perfectionism. And I would argue that perfectionism is a complete fiction. It was a deliberate fiction. It's an ideological fiction. It was invented for good reason, political and social reasons, but it is not a representative of the actual operations of the system at any time. There was no Garden of Eden where there was perfect competition. In fact, in the Garden of Eden, there was no competition, but that's another story. There was no moment in history where this perfect competition prevailed. Yet the typical heterodox position is to say that competition used to be close to perfect in the past. They will not say when, in the past, but now we have monopoly and power and oligopoly. For this course, what is I need you to keep in mind is that in the classical tradition, there is not this opposition between perfect and imperfect competition, because the notion of competition, the notion of the invisible hand, is a notion which is radically different than this joined set of perfect and imperfect competition, these duals of each other. And so when we start to talk about competition, as we will shortly, we will see that they refer to something radically different. Now, I'm going to stop here and move to this question of classical, but any questions or comments at this point? Is it familiar to you? Is this making you unhappy in some way? I need to hear. Yes?
As we said that the state becomes important as an active role player for the heterodoxy in the economy.
I'm sorry, you have to say that louder, and then not only will now pick it up, I want everyone else to hear it.
Right. You said the state for the heterodoxy in the economy, the state is an active player for a very particular role in terms of social protection. So how important is Ricardo for the economic heterodoxy? This idea of the double movement.
That's a very good question, a little bit beyond what I need to do here, because I'm not really talking about heterodox economics. I just want to lay out, there are certainly strands in heterodox economics where Polanyi plays a very important role, but it's not central to, you won't find him referred to in Kaletsky, for instance. So one could try to find a path from him to heterodox economics. But really the founding economic character of the details, you need to talk about relative prices and wage rates and interest rates and all of that detail is really Kaletsky. And I won't have time to develop that here, but we do it in other courses. Any other questions? Yes.
Just to go ahead and at the list of what the actually say, you just say the opposite. They just develop a list.
How do you develop a list of imperfections? Well, that's a very good question, and this is what I mean by saying that these are duals. Suppose I look in the world and I see that firms set prices. Why would that trouble me? Ricardo says that, Smith says that, Marx says that, Malthus says that, Mill says that, firms set prices. Why would it trouble me? Why would I focus on it? Because in the theory of perfect competition, firms don't set prices. They take prices. They take prices as given. It's given to them by either the Walrasian auctioneer, if you begin from Walras, or by some mysterious missing entity that we call the market. There's no person attached, no agent attached to the market. So they take prices. So if you begin from that framework, then firms are price takers. If I observe firms setting prices, I go, aha, imperfection. But only if I believe in the perfection. It's like being a failed Catholic. You always refer back sooner or later. Okay? Any other questions? Yes.
Because the Orthodox theory plays such a big role in economics that you can't not refer to it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Believing perfection, have it in mind, or just you're trying to always argue with the Orthodox theory?
Yes, I totally agree that you have to, that why we teach it here. This is a graduate school. You see that 80% of what we teach here is orthodox theory. But for the same reason that if you are living in a country that has a certain set of beliefs, then you would have to learn those beliefs and learn the language. But it doesn't follow you have to share those beliefs or you have to agree with them. And way theories change over time is precisely because people begin to question and create alternate perspectives. Now, this is a moment in history where that question has become really crucial. If orthodox theory is correct, then there are a certain set of prescriptions. But if it's wrong, then the consequences of that are not borne by economists. They're borne by the people we practice on. You know, in the old days, if you were an astrologer and you got it wrong, the kings had a right to do some really nasty things to you to sort of give you some feedback. We don't have that feedback mechanism. You fly in from the IMF World Bank, you propose austerity, and you go back to your hotel, have some drinks, and fly back. And the people get screwed in the process. So it's very crucial to understand how the world operates if you wish to affect the world. And I believe that part of what we try to do at the New School is to teach people to think critically, including about what I'm going to say. I want you to read Ricardo and Smith and Marx, and of course, you will read elsewhere all the standard theory, including Walras and Keynes and post-Keynesian economics, so that you can form some sense of what you want to ground yourself in. But my point here is that it's not as complicated as it seems, because there aren't so many alternatives. Perfection, imperfection appears as two sets of alternatives, but from my point of view, they are very strongly linked. So you have perfectionism, imperfectionism, much of modern macro is right around that now, and then you have what I would call real competition and real macro dynamics. I won't be able to get to that here, but you can see the roots of that. I'm going to try to point it out as we go, the roots of that in the classical tradition. So I'm seeing this as a set of possibilities and ideas which we will look at empirically, by the way, empirically for modern phenomena, to show you that these are ideas that have some bite. Then perhaps we can construct them into something more. So my idea is to disrupt you as much as possible and disrupt your understanding of economics as much as possible. Yes, sorry.
Explore all the social or political functions of proliferating the fiction that you've been talking about?
No. Broad answer is no, because the course is focused on a set of readings, but I hope that you will be able to pick up the resonance of that. And all of your, in this course you don't get to do papers, but this is only the beginning course. In the more advanced courses you can pursue many lines. You may pursue, there was a student from Yale who became convinced that this was all wrong and wrote a wonderful paper about Austrian economics, for instance, about Friedman, for instance, in the past. That's perfectly fine. I want you to think about what you're getting. If you choose it, perfectly fine. But first, find out what the options are. Yes?
Can you give us examples of governments or nations who have reached that point where they're somewhere in between the two schools of thought, or at least try to do that, where there are free markets with a considerable amount of government intervention whenever needed, and some sort of a sense of social or greater social interest involved? Or
that, we could talk about that, but not here, because this course is not about everything. I want to try and emphasize that these three alternatives that we face, a very highly super-developed orthodox theory, fairly well-developed heterodox theory focused on imperfections, and a potentially developable classical theory are the alternatives, but I cannot talk about the alternative implications until we get into the theory, because it won't make any sense. My main point is that we interpret the world through these theories. And you need to see that there's more than one possible interpretation and more than one possible implication. And to do that, you have to suspend your question until we get far enough along so that you can begin to see some implications. Otherwise, it's just an assertion on my part. Okay? Yes?
You also mentioned Galetsky as an imperfectionist theorist, and like as far as I know, his starting point was Marx, right? So how can you characterize him as like being predominantly a imperfectionist theorist that mainly wants to show the imperfections in the ideal market theory? I don't know.
That's a very, very good question. I don't know if everybody heard that, but the question is, if Kalecki's starting point is Marx, why is he viewed as an imperfectionist? Well, he actually hadn't read much Marx. His starting point is from a little bit from Rosa Luxemburg, but only focusing on certain aspects. Let's say that one of the things that Kalecki picks up from that tradition is the idea of class. But it appears in Kalecki as a difference between those who get income from profits and those who income from wages. That's it. There's no class struggle in Kalecki in that sense. And Kalecki's own history, this is a digression, but I cannot resist digressions. But when Kalecki first wrote about his theory of the distribution of income, the determination of wages and profits, in Kalecki, it's the firms who decide what workers get as wages. Because whatever workers get, firms add the price on top, and they give themselves the profit that they want. Then Kalecki ran into this difficulty that from his point of view, the wage share, which is the distribution between wage and profit, is determined entirely by capital, and there's no role for what he observed clearly, which is the enormous historical struggle to determine real wages and standard living and all that. And so he began at the end of his life to try to introduce back into his model the idea that if workers fight hard enough, capitalists may not be able to give the markup they want. But that's a very roundabout way. And it's limited by the whole idea that capitalists have the monopoly power to get any profit they want. Now, your question opens up this very interesting issue, which is in the classical tradition, capitalists do not have the power to determine their long-run profitability. Competition does that. They participate in competition, and some win and some lose, but competition determines profit rates, and the struggle between the wages of workers and profitability is an intrinsic struggle, which they had no trouble recognizing because it was taking place in front of their eyes. They were not looking to the idealized world at all. They were looking to the world in front of them and trying to abstraction as typification of the actual, not abstraction as idealization, which became the project of neoclassical economics. So if you approach it that way, you begin to see something quite different. And I'm going to point it out as we go along. But there's no substitute for reading the greats, always. Yes, one last question, I have to move on.
The first one is wondering why the neoclassical economics is still persistent. In spite of the lack of the reality, and so it's wondering why it stays persistent. And secondly, is there anything we can learn from the economics?
Okay, so remind me of the second question. I have a very short-term memory problem. So let me do the first one. Why, if neoclassical economics is so divorced from reality, and this, by the way, is a widely recognized criticism of it, why does it persist? And I think that's an excellent question. But ask yourself this. Do we know of any erosion life where if we tell to people that this is different, what their belief is different from what we can show, that they will simply turn around and say, oh, you're right? Recently, 3 days ago, a man in India was shot. It was in the New York Times. He made his life dedication to go and challenge superstitions. He was an educated man. He lived very poorly, and he went from one place to another challenging these. 2 men came up and shot him several times and killed him. Why? Because he was challenging accepted beliefs. They did not ask, is your counter-argument sensible? We know from social life that it is very difficult to change what people believe, even if the evidence is overwhelming. Climate change? If I may get the statistic wrong, but if I remember reading it just recently, that 40% of people in the United States believe in creationism. So you could ask, how such a long interval, over 100 years of Darwin, people still don't accept Darwin? And the answer is social life doesn't proceed by the logic of facts. It proceeds by a different logic. And that's a very important point already. Because if that's true, why do we model people as if they proceed by logic? It's completely inconsistent. I cannot imagine that Smith would have been surprised to learn that most people believe in superstitions. But in neoclassical economics, there's no room for that, and yet it is, in my opinion, a superstition. Your second question.
What can you learn from neoclassical economics?
You can learn many things. Neoclassical economists study if you leave the model behind and you look at the empirical evidence and you look at the historical studies, they study many things about how the system operates. But their difficulty is how to put it back into that box. And in fact, the people who tend to do those studies tend to therefore wander off by saying, well, there's local monopoly power, there's imperfection, whatever. But when you come to the interpretation of the system as a whole, you end up saying, well, perfect competition, or imperfections are preventing it from behaving properly. Now think about this again. If you believe that the system automatically tends to produce full employment, and you have a situation as we do now, with large-scale unemployment, not just in the United States. It's now, 7.5%, but that's the official figure, not counting the people who are partially employed and all that. The other figures are on the BLS website. You can see alternate measures of unemployment. Typically, they're 3 times as high. So it's like 18 to 20% would be the unemployment rate now when you adjust for partially unemployed people, people who've given up, discouraged people, and so on. That is a lot of people. If you believe that the market fundamentally can solve that, then what you want to do is have more competition. You want to have more markets. You want to get institutions and the state out of the way. If, on the other hand, you believe that is a natural outcome of the market, then you'll be moving towards a worse outcome by having more markets. So it's very fundamental to how we proceed in the world today. Okay, so now we come to the classicals. And let's start by first saying who I mean by the classicals here. In this course, we can really only cover Smith and Ricardo in the classical tradition, though there's some other readings that you can pick up on. I'd be happy to point you towards. And then there's Marx, who's not a classical economist because he himself aims to go well beyond that, and does go well beyond that, but comes from that root. So the course covers that set of people. And then the question that leads to is, well, why should we read these people? I mean, if economic theory has got the problems of the world solved, we can read it as a kind of historical interest, as an educational interest, and that's certainly completely valid. But I would argue that there are other dimensions. First of all, their work is the root of neoclassical theory and also of Keynesian and post-Keynesian theories. I'll try and point that out as we go along, where these questions arise, how the answers are given, and how the modern answers relate to these. And secondly, because the existing theories themselves do not simply build upon that tradition, but also depart from it in substantive ways. And that departure leads to the question, is that a departure that we should undertake, or it's a departure that can be questioned? And I'm going to question it here, clearly. I would argue that the existing theories are not adequate to the world that we live in. I made that point before in the previous section of this lecture, and that we have a lot to learn from the classical tradition and from the work in Marx. That they provide a rich source of ideas and insights, understandings about modern economics, not just capitalism, society, alienation, but economic processes, wages, prices, profits, exchange rates, interest rates, growth, cycles. And that therefore they provide a rich source for construction of an alternate foundation different from the perfect, imperfect dichotomy which dominates the profession now. And that leads to the second set of questions, which is what are these characteristic features of this classical and Marxian tradition? How are they different from the features that I described for neoclassical economics and for Keynesian and, well, post-Keynesian economics? First of all, one of the characteristic features is that economic activities are embedded in a social context. That context is class, gender, caste, institutions, so that we cannot speak of economic activities as if they are pure and purely self-interested in the way that orthodox theory typically does. Secondly, the focus of the classical economists is on industrial capitalism, and which arose in England in the 17th century, and class appears as a very central feature. And that raises a question of what class is about. I will not be discussing that question, but we will get an idea about it now, Catherine, from Monty Python. This is a clip from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I don't know how many people have seen that movie. Brilliant. You should see it. In this movie, Arthur, King Arthur, has been given a magical sword by a lady in the lake. That sword is called Excalibur, and it has magical properties that enable him to go on and do wonderful things. And the lady of the lake is prominent because in this version of it, she gives him the sword, which gives him this power, but also confers on him the right to be the king. So the sword is his sign of his sovereignty, and that plays a big role in this little clip. Arthur is searching in the movie, he's searching for knights to join him on the quest for the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail, in the Arthurian legend, was a cup or a vessel of some sort that had magical properties, wonderful properties, and was made of gold and precious jewels and so on. So here you have Arthur going along, and you should see, I had to cut out this wonderful clip that Keith did of the precursor to this one because we don't have enough time, but we'll put it on the on Blackboard, and it's a clip where Arthur comes to a castle seeking knights to join him. But here, he's going through the fields, and you'll see that Arthur consists of one guy followed by another guy with coconuts to make the sound of horses, because it's a low-budget movie. They don't have horses. So with that, this is the background to Arthur's quest. So what's lovely about this clip is that normally in a movie of this time, you take for granted the social structure. You don't ask the point of view of the peasant, so to speak. And what's great about Monty Python is that they challenge that right away by having the peasants speak up in a language, of course, they didn't have, but to bring home the absurdity of the acceptance of the social structure, any given social structure. It's not just about class, it's about other things also. I encourage you to watch the movie because it has many interesting elements. Some of the others, including the one precursor to this, is the section where they have an interesting discussion about coconuts, which is quite relevant to this clip. And then a subsequent one, which is about knowledge. And we'll play the one about knowledge just before your midterm so that you get the point. Okay. So if economic acts are embedded in a social structure, then obviously the social structure is open to question and modification, and it changes over time. And that means that you can talk about the evolution of the social structure and of society, and you can think past and future in reference to the existing social structure. Now what's interesting about that is that that's not possible within the neoclassical theory because there is no social structure. It's an idealized framework in which there is nothing that you can grab hold of in terms of social structure and class. Everything of that is external to the basic model of self-interested individuals and self-interested agents in general. So in in the classical tradition, capitalism is understood as a historical entity. And the significance of that is that they could see capitalism developing from feudalism. They could see that it was a different social order, and more importantly, that it was a social order. It was not some universal ideal framework, but a framework whose birth pangs involved lots of violence, lots of disruption, lots of advances and losses, and that was visible. And they kept that in their view, so to speak, even as they began to talk about the laws of motion of this new social structure. Because then they began to understand that it is a social structure with particular patterns and logic. And that logic becomes of crucial interest to Smith and in a more developed form of Ricardo, and particularly of Marx, of the logic of capitalism. The logic meaning of the reproduction of its patterns through its internal reinforcing structures. That's what I mean by the logic. So there comes then in the classical tradition the emphasis on characteristic patterns produced by this logic, by the DNA of capitalism. And they take the form of different phrases. In Smith, the term is the invisible hand and the patterns that it produces. That's the logic, the force behind the logic. And it produces equalization of wages in some form and profit rates, but it produces technical change and growth. And in Smith, a falling rate of profit, and eventually a kind of heat death of capitalism. So there's also in Smith the notion that it's a limited historical entity. In Ricardo also, the same thing. Ricardo uses the term not the invisible hand, but laws of motion. Laws of political economy. And Marx uses the term laws of motion because he wants to emphasize particularly its constantly dynamic and changing character. But they all emphasize that this is a particular historical form. And indeed, all three of them have in common notion of a falling rate of profit. And since profitability is the central driving force of the system, that implies something about the end of the system, about its limits also. You don't get that in orthodox economics. There's nothing like that at the ideal form. They emphasize also the dominance of capital over labor and land owners. And that's, again, they understand that this is a system in which capital plays a dominant role. It's not that consumers play the dominant role, but that capital plays the dominant role. Owners of capital, operators of capital, hence the firms, the corporations of the modern, these are the dominant entities. Dominant does not mean they decide everything. Dominant means that they have a strong undue influence or due influence, but they have a powerful influence, a shaping influence, and ultimately limiting influence. In this notion of the dominance of capital then comes the idea of the critical importance of the profit motive. It's not the only motive in capitalism. It may not even appear to be a dominant motive in capitalism. But it is a fundamental motive because it provides the shape and limits to the system. Think about this. 70% of consumption in the United States comes from 70% of effective demand comes from consumers. And most of consumer consumption comes from wages. Now wages, one could say, people who get wages are not doing it, not spending money for the profit motive, so it's pretty clear that the profit motive has no role in one of the most fundamental elements of aggregate demand. But Smith and Ricardo and Marx would immediately say that's not true. Because people get wages because they're employed. And they're employed because their employment promises profitability. And where that promise of profitability disappears or is shaky, that employment also contracts. And then consumption contracts. So the idea that consumption is independent of the typical construction, let's say, in Keynesian economics, it's just not true in the classical framework, because in fact The bulk of consumption comes from wages, but wages depend on profits, and the remainder of consumption comes from people who get income from profits. So one could reverse that and say that consumption comes from profits. Yeah?
But doesn't Smith make it clear that the entire purpose of production is to benefit the consumer?
No, he doesn't say that, and that's one reason I want you to read Smith.
Well, no, I'm saying from the readings I did, it says there was a kind of the sole end and purpose of production is for the consumer.
No. I will try and show you that he doesn't say that, in fact. That is, in fact, the neoclassical reading of Smith. And Smith, like many great works, has phrases and elements that can appear to give that. But in fact, as we go through, Smith will talk about the dominance of profitability. And there are passages where he talks about, give you an example, international trade. What's the purpose of international trade? We would say in modern economics is trade between nations improves one nation, and that's orthodox economics. Smith says, no, that's not the point. Individual firms try to make money abroad and home. And why do they do that? Because they want profit. The consequences may be beneficial or not, but it's not the motivation. Okay? And again, in the classical traditions, they're not always in agreement among the classicals. So I'm sort of glossing over the disagreements, but we're going to come to them when we read them directly. Okay. Importance of the profit motive. We're living in a world today which I would argue in the middle of a Great Depression, and they occur with remarkable regularity. We're going to talk about that at the end of the class, the empirical patterns. So we're pretty much on schedule for this Great Depression. But what is quite striking is that the depression comes about not because consumers suddenly forget to spend money, because they lose their jobs and they don't have the money to spend. And there's a difference between the idea that they contract consumption because they just suddenly feel like it, and they contract consumption because their debts are too high or because their jobs are gone and therefore they can't sustain the debts and so on. Profitability then displays its importance precisely when it breaks, when the rhythm of the system and the circulation system breaks. Again, it's not the only element. You could decide, we could collectively decide tomorrow to stop spending money. And that would have a dramatic impact, by the way. But there would also be a lot of opposition to that because a lot of profits will be lost from that. On the other hand, we could lose our jobs tomorrow and stop spending money for a very different reason. Those are not symmetric. But they're all possible. The next point, which is very crucial in the classical tradition, is that the patterns which appear in classical economics come through turbulence, through disorder. That the process, when we talk about competition, it's not a process that leads to optimality in the trivial neoclassical sense. It's a process in which the weak get killed by the strong. Now, whether that's optimal or not depends on which end of that scale you happen to be. From a general point of view, you can say that stronger firms survive and they are more cost effective and they go over time, but that does not imply that there is no social consequence to this, there's no social disruption, and maybe no social damage done from this evolutionary process. And that's like in evolution in general. We can say that evolution has a feedback mechanism, and it winnows out some, but it doesn't follow that it winnows out always the right, or that the path developed turns out to be optimal. In what sense? Dinosaurs were extremely good at what they did until they ceased to be good at what they did. And little rats, rat-like creatures, if I understand it correctly, shrews, are now developed into the biggest predators that Earth has seen, which is us. So it's not obvious that you cannot make the logic argument that there are feedback mechanisms and evolutionary mechanisms that they lead somehow to optimality. In that kind of context, there's no meaning to that term, really. They lead to improvement in the fitness or survival, but that can lead to advantages for others and bad consequences for others. I'm going to come back to this point at the end because it's kind of crucial. If that's true, then the patterns that we see are not patterns of optimality, but patterns of disorder and order of order appearing in and through disorder. In and through disorder. Disorder is the mechanism of the order. Now, what does that mean? It sounds like a great phrase. It is a great phrase, as a matter of fact, but it has some real content. Imagine that I say to you that equalization of wages in the classical tradition means that wages go above and below each other, but there's no moment where they're ever equal. What do I mean by that? Let's suppose that this side of the room has high wages and this side of the room has low wages for any reason. That's going to create a tendency for people to move from this low wage side to the high wage side. In the process, they're going to disrupt wages here because the supply of labor is going to shrink, so wages are going to rise, and they're going to increase the supply of labor here, and wages are going to fall. It doesn't follow that they will simply stop when they're equal, because the flux of people over will inevitably drive wages down there until that incentive begins to dry out, and raise wages here until the opposite movement takes place. And so it's perfectly possible, analytically, mathematically, and logically, to imagine this process as one of constant overshooting and undershooting. Now that means that balance is never there except by being imbalanced. Balance is the set of offsetting imbalance. And if you understand that, then you begin to see that the process of balance is one in which you can have overshooting and undershooting. Overshooting and correction. Now, think of what that means. The sum of overshooting and undershooting is a kind of balance, right? And we could say, therefore, that's equilibrium. Well, but are we not living in that moment of balance now? Did we not go way, way off the sustainable path? And are we not coming not only down to balance, but well below it? From this point of view, the fact that you get something like equilibrium doesn't mean that equilibrium is a good thing. The Great Depression is an equilibrating mechanism from this point of view, right? It wiped out the excess inflated asset values, it wiped out jobs which were not sustainable, profitability which are not sustainable, and people die from this. Just like a forest fire gets rid of an overly dense thicket of plants and trees, and create some kind of balance in the space, it doesn't follow that that's desirable. It follows that this is an inherent, it is true that it's an inherent process, but it's not confused, should not be confused with optimality. And one of the things that orthodoxy does is make this balancing mechanism equivalent to optimality. They certainly argue, certainly Smith and Ricardo argue about this balancing mechanism produces specific outcomes. And these outcomes are broadly preferable because capitalism is dynamic, it produces new technology, it punishes firms that are backward in developing technology or backward in lowering costs and all that. But it's Marx who brings up most clearly the consequences of this for labor. And we'll see that Ricardo himself goes through a change of mind about what are the consequences of mechanization for labor. Initially he says, the workers displaced will find jobs. Later he comes back and says, this is his scientific superiority. He says, I was wrong. It doesn't follow that if mechanization displaces workers, they will simply find jobs elsewhere. They may never find jobs. So we have to look at the system in terms of its properties. And the classical tradition tries to do that. Whether it's adequate or not, we will see as we go along. We will talk about it, and we'll look at empirical evidence too as we go along. The next thing, which is crucial, is the idea that growth is an inherent feature of the system. In the classical tradition, you get always this emphasis that each firm is trying to grow, each element is trying to grow. And that growth is the normal property of the system. It's not something that you add on as an externality into your model. It's very typical in Keynesian and neoclassical models. They talk about a static framework, and growth is brought in from the outside. And that's only if you make it to the second year graduate course, after you do the first static analysis. This is a non-trivial issue because if you want to formalize the system, you have to have the tools mathematical tools, analytical tools, and the empirical sense to understand how a turbulent, growing system can maintain some kind of balance. Because the miracle of capitalism is that it does balance. Because no one is there to direct it. It's the market that's feedback, overshooting, undershooting. But it does maintain some kind of balance, but that balance can involve massive overextension and collapse also. Marx particularly, but Smith and Ricardo also emphasize that the growth is equally rooted in the profit motive. The same motive that operates the hiring of workers and therefore the generation of consumption demand from workers. The same motive that operates the introduction of new technology, that of pricing, competition among firms of how to set prices. That motive also gives individual capital the incentive to grow. Now again, think about that. What does that mean? Every capital has, this is emphasized particularly in Marx, of the idea of capital as self-expanding value. The purpose of making an investment is to make money. I don't mean the word investment in a generic sense like getting an education or learning how to play the guitar. I mean it in the proper sense of money-making activity, of making a capital investment, is to make money. But that money that you make, which is your profit, if you make it, and many firms don't make it, if you make it, is potentially a way of making more money. Because if you plow it back in, you can get more profit if you're lucky. So this is not just a circle, it's a spiral. It's inherent in the motive structure of the system that every capital makes money and is impelled to try to make more money to preserve itself from other capitals who are doing the same thing. Everybody wants to cut into your market, you therefore have to be cutting into theirs. Everybody wants to improve their technology to kill you, so you have to improve yours to try to kill them. That's normal. You cut prices to attract people, others have to match your prices and maybe cut them so that they take them back from you. Again, that's normal. That's a normal process of competition. So if you look at it from this point of view, the kind of globalization of capitalism is part of its inherent characteristic feature. Capital is always seeking to escape its boundaries, create new places. Right now, the boundaries have expanded to encompass the whole world, and we're already looking at the moon and other places for potential capital investment, profit-making investments. Not feasible yet economically, but they might be at some time in the future. The next very crucial common element in the classical tradition, especially emphasized in Smith and Marx, less so in Ricardo, is that technical change is driven by the profit motive also. You will read the classic example in Smith of the pin factory, in which capitalists bring together people who do elements of a process like making pins. They bring them all together in one place to speed up the process. Why? Why do they bring them together? And Smith's answer is very clear, because they can increase the productivity of labor. And why do you increase the productivity of labor? Because in this case, you can capture that increase as a reduction in cost and increase of profit. They're not interested in increasing the productivity of labor per se. They do it because it increases profitability. So you turn the problem around. Those increases in the productivity of labor which do not increase profitability tend to be downplayed or even resisted. They might even hurt profitability. Therefore, they're resisted. Marx has a wonderful riff about locks in Theories of Surplus Value. And he says, well, capitalists create places that people want to break into, houses that people want to break into, and part of the thing they do is create locks to protect that. So that's a way to keep their wealth safe. But of course, thieves also increase the productivity of labor by trying to figure out and improve, getting better at picking locks. But that's not necessarily counted as a social gain. yet increasing profitability is counted as a social gain. You have to step back and ask the difference between those things which are rewarded evolutionarily in the system from profitability and those which have to struggle upstream, so to speak, against that. Doesn't mean they can't survive. It means a gradient is tougher, definitely. I learned how to pick a lock, by the way. It was really interesting. And I was able to do it once, and then I haven't been able to do it since. But anyway, it's quite interesting. So this aspect that mechanization, that increasing the productivity of labor is driven by profitability is already imminent in Smith, because he talks about capitalism's great strength, which is that it increases the productivity of labor. My point is it increases the productivity of labor principally because it increases the profitability of capital. It's a filter. There are many increases of productivity of labor which are not supported because they don't increase or maybe even harm profitability. Now, Marx makes this central because he makes the argument that this transforms the relations of production. It transforms the way workers relate to their tools. And he has a really startling and insightful analysis of the fact that when capitalism develops and tools become separated from the user of the tool, then the worker is not working with the tool, or the tool is not working for the worker. It's the other way around. The worker is working for the tool. Now, anybody who has worked in recent times recognizes that you work in a business. The computer is your boss, but the computer is watching you. And we're going to see some lovely cartoons about that along the way. That he calls this the inversion that takes place when capital takes over the labor process, in which the tools now belong to the owners of the labor process, and workers become subordinate to the tools. Again, I'm going to show you a wonderful clip from Charlie Chaplin in the beginning of the modern times, which is just about this. Chaplin was very aware of this. Lastly, there is always in the classical tradition a potential conflict between the private aims of capital and the social goals of the community. Always. Smith brings this out most clearly, and I'm going to show you when we get there how Smith talks about the difference between the interests of capital and the interests of society. That's a part that doesn't appear in boardrooms when they have these little books about Adam Smith as your model for your CEO, or that doesn't, because Smith is basically saying don't trust CEOs, and that doesn't show up usually in the comic book version. But Smith is talking about what he believes is a logical consequence of this difference in incentive and in motive between the dominant force in capitalist society, which is capital, and the society as a whole. And that's a very interesting point, because obviously that's something that Marx develops to a greater extent. But so does Ricardo. When Ricardo starts talking about mechanization not necessarily being good for workers and can disemploy workers, he's talking about the same thing. He's talking about the fact that what's good for capital is not necessarily good for workers, and therefore not necessarily good for society abstractly. And this is an important point. Society doesn't exist abstractly. In the classical tradition, at the very least, you have the split by class. You have the landlord class, you have the capitalist class, and the working class. And they understood perfectly well, because they looked concretely, that they are splits within these classes. We would add today gender, but if you're going, coming from India, you would have caste. These are social structures, consist of hierarchies and divisions. And so when we talk about society as a whole, you can't talk about that unless you abstract from all of these things. And that's typically what orthodox economics teaches you to do, encourages you to look at society as a whole. There's social welfare functions, which are optimized and maximized. There's a representative agent who represents consumers as a whole, and agents representing firms subordinate to the representative agent. That is not only a friction, it's a crock. It's deliberately designed to misrepresent. And you will not find that kind of misrepresentation in the classical tradition. This brings up then the question of the state. If the system does not produce socially optimal outcomes, then the state doesn't just appear as something off stage, but appears on stage. And again, it's not difficult. Ricardo takes one position about the state, which is kind of minimalist position. Smith is somewhat different. Marx is again different. We're going to come to that. But it's not true that the state is simply an interference in an ideal, optimal outcome. The state plays a very central role historically, we know, in the development of capitalism. It certainly developed in the origins of capitalism, but we know in every country the state plays a central role. That centrality is not an accident or an externality. It's an inherent part of the way that the different groups interact. The state plays a role as an independent actor, but also as one with limits, strong limits. And that brings me back to the original point. What is the limit to the state? And the limit comes about from the political and economic consequences of affecting profitability. Imagine that tomorrow Obama were to convince the Republicans, I admit it's a stretch, but anyway, convince them that really what we need to do is to full employment and every firm should be required to hire a certain number of workers. What's wrong with that? It would solve the problem, right? The obvious difficulty with that, of course, is that there would be a profound reaction from businesses because it would hurt their profitability. And that reminds us that it is not a technical problem. It's a problem in a system in which profitability is the dominant motive and where therefore there is a clash of interest which is always there. So there's one thing that I would ask you to keep in mind throughout the reading is there that they talk about class as inherent, they talk about conflict as inherent, they talk about turbulence as inherent, and when Smith talks about the superiority of capitalism, he does not mean optimality as it's done now. Indeed, no one is more lavish in their praise about the superiority of capitalism than Marx. Read the Communist Manifesto again, and read these passages where he talks about the superiority of capitalism, how it destroys other systems because it is able to do it. He doesn't mean that it's better in the sense that it's more desirable. He means that in the evolutionary sense, it is the dinosaur of the time. So with that, we can say that in this, hang on, let me just finish that. From this framework, inequality is normal. It doesn't come from an imperfection, it comes from the logic. Equilibrium doesn't necessarily mean preferred, since equilibrium can mean exactly what we have today, the bursting of a bubble and devastation, social and personal devastation. It may be part of the logic, but it does not follow that it's preferred outcome. Unemployment is normal because, as you will see, Marx particularly emphasizes that the system creates and maintains a pool of unemployed people. Whether that argument is correct or not, we will discuss when we come along, but we'll also look to see empirically whether it makes sense. It's not an argument that Keynesians accept. It's not an argument that neoclassicals accept. But it is a distinct argument. And the last one is that the state does not run the system. This is important because in orthodox economics, the state can only essentially or largely harms a system unless it stays within very narrow boundaries. And Keynesian economics, the state has a very great potential because it can, as Keynes himself says, it can fulfill the possibilities of capitalism. It can make capitalism do the things that it promises to do and that doesn't, like full employment. There's a much more nuanced view of the state and a much more limited role for the state in the classical tradition. It's not true that the state has no beneficial impact, but it's also not true that it can do anything it wants, because ultimately it must confront these limits that come from profitability. And so the theme of the course will be, in part, to see how these limits and laws arise from these very simple principles. There will be no optimizing, no maximizing, no all-seeing agents, no foundation for a macro built on that, because it's not necessary. You can describe and understand the phenomena without that. So, thank you, and we will begin next time. Do try and come on time. That's kind of crucial for this kind of thing. Questions? Yes. I have, yeah, a few minutes. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. No, I'm sorry. I saw you first. You go ahead. You had to have first.
All right. I was wondering, is there room in the Orthodox tradition or in any of the heterodox traditions for institutions that are non-state but also considered non-market, or just that dichotomy, either state institution or it's in the market and they're all together?
Indeed, there is a whole tradition of economics called institutionalism, where the role of institutions plays a big role. But that question has to be integrated into some framework about how prices are determined, how wages are determined, how profits are determined, and all of that. And in some arguments, these are largely done through institutions. That's more amenable or most amenable to the Keynesian and post-Keynesian tradition. It's very little present in the neoclassical for obvious reasons, because in the ideal model, there are no institutions in the first place. So they have to appear as impositions. Now, in the classical tradition, institutions are there from the start. What is class? What is a king? The king in the Monty Python is also the king in Adam Smith, admittedly not quite in the same way, but the king is present right away as a taken for granted entity. And it's certainly questioned in Marx, definitely, from a historical point of view. So yes, institutions play a very big role. To give another kind of example, institutions such as unions play a very important role in Keynesian theory, but they play also a critical role in Marxian theory, because they involve this very fundamental struggle between the employer and the employed. We will not hit all of these points, because the course is a history of thought course in some fundamental sense, because I want you to read the originals, and they've been dead a long time. So their institutional reach will not catch up to the present necessarily, but I think you'll be surprised how relevant it can be to the modern era. One more question, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned growth as an inherent feature in classical economics, and not as an externality. Can you give an example of growth that's treated as an externality?
Externality, sure. In Keynesian theory, typically, the short-run equilibrium is static, right? You have investment, which determines effective demand through the multiplier. It determines the level of output. Where does growth come from? Then Keynesian theory has to twist itself into printing growth, and now for the first 50 years, there was almost no discussion of that, by the way. Then growth was said, well, investment is growing over time, so demand is growing over time. So growth comes from investment. Where does investment growth from? That's not obvious. There's a debate between Harrod on one side that says you can't treat investment as autonomous, because investment increases capacity also. If it increases capacity, it can't just be anything. It has to be such that the capacity meets the demand. When you do that, growth becomes endogenous, but you don't have a multiplier, because the investment is no longer exogenous. It's endogenous. So there's a whole series of issues about growth that come in Keynesian economics, and typically they appear as something that you do at a later stage, but not built in from the beginning. I think it's Jan Kregel has an article which he talks about the correspondence between Roy Harrod was professor at Oxford, who would probably be the greatest post-Keynesian, because he was Keynes's younger contemporary, the first one to formalize Keynesian economics into a sort of mathematical framework, also into what became known as ISLM, though he didn't get the credit for that. Hicks did, but Harrod writes to Keynes, and he says, look, growth is not something that comes in after you deal with equilibrium and all that. It's there from the beginning. And Keynes says, yes, I know what you mean. We have short-run equilibrium, and then investment jumps up to a different level, and then output goes. And he says, no, it's not that. Investment is never there. It's always moving. And Keynes says, yeah, I know. It moves from this level to another level. And they're really talking past each other. Keynes is thinking static, short run, because he got that from neoclassical economics, which is also static and short run typically. And then the long run comes later. The point is that growth is not a long-run phenomena, it's an imminent phenomenon. It's always happening. It doesn't mean it's positive, it can be negative. We're in a negative growth situation, but the path is always changing. And that means that the formalizations and analysis should begin from the idea of a moving path. Now that's exactly what laws of motion, what Marx's point about laws of motion is. The system is moving. Now we often formalize these in simple ways because that's the best we can do, but we shouldn't be confused by the fact that we're not good enough to do it properly and the fact that therefore it doesn't exist. We have to think of a better way to do it. And modern tools, nonlinear dynamics and agent-based simulation and all kinds of tools can deal with this in a better way, but by no means an adequate way, in my opinion. But we're getting there. We're getting a little bit better. Yes, one more.
Pockets of population whose social context is still feudalism.
Is what?
Is still feudalism. So there are pockets of population whose social context to a great degree is still feudalism. There are serf land lord relationships which still exist for pockets of population.
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's outside this course, but it's an interesting question whether such pockets do exist in the sense that they are independent of this huge gravitational field of capitalism. They're constantly being pulled by it and dissolved by it and reformed by it. So yes, you don't want to reduce their autonomy or their activities to just capitalist activities, but we haven't yet said what these capitalist activities are. What you will find surprising is that many of the elements of the representation of capitalism in the classical tradition are indeed applicable to so-called non-capitalist activities, because of course they are observing that transition in part because of that. And it's a continuing transition. It continues on the edges of any boundary of the system. So that's a good question. Bring it up again when we talk about, say, about wages or prices and so on. Okay, folks, see you next week.
Okay, that may seem a little ponderous, I understand, but I think it's important to note that there are some key elements from this first lecture by Anwar Sheikh. We haven't gotten to Ricardo and rent yet, and we will get there. I felt it was important to put a foundation in there, and I think that given that it's at the New School, you can see what the issues are, and I think Sheikh does an incredible job in defining the difference between classical and neoclassical, and then to place neo-Keynesian or post-Keynesian within that particular context, and also to understand the difference between orthodox and heterodox approaches. And in that last little segment, you can note that the difference of immanence, I think, is really important, because immanence describes the dynamic nature of an economy, which is not dissimilar from Steve Keen's approach to the whole question of the dynamics or the structural dynamics of the economy, which I think in Keynes's situation, it negates an entire body of pedagogy. In other words, why can't economics just sort of ignore what Sheikh was talking about and say, well, let's just simply start over again, which is what Steve Keen is trying to do, and which is not a bad thing. But it also requires, with all due respect, a whole different way of approaching higher education. For example, in terms of foundation courses, probably in every institution, there probably should be a data science course as a core requirement. Of course, it'd be taught differently, but it would be a relationship between data science and the liberal arts, which does exist in various institutions, but not very many, and certainly not widely thought. That's just one example among many, and I think there are a whole bunch of other things that would be part of a core curriculum, but that gets us a little far along. Ultimately, though, we'll get back to rent. So let me stop there. This is the autonomouscollective.net. I'm introducing sort of the foundational elements of classical political economy. We'll get back to Marx because that's where it's going to wind up anyway, where it does in history. And I think that you can see all of those elements even in the current situation, which is why I brought up Steve Keen, because he brings us exactly back to the question of immanence, externality versus, as it were, internality. I mean, there's an essentialist bias in the classical and the neoclassical model that is part of the discourse. That is to assume what counts as an economy is not an isolated matter, but rather socially integrated across the board. So anyway, that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I think that that's where it exists.